And you've got me, I can go anywhere
Yes.
in the board. I don't know that I will, but there we go. It's spinning circle. And that's me. Okay, good, yeah. It doesn't look like there's nobody here. I guess I didn't even really need these tables. I need the table for me. But I'm frozen. Oh, no, I'm not. I'm just looking at my monitor. 2 are watching now. 1 is me and 1 is you? Okay. All right. It's just 5:30, right? 1 is watching now. Are we doing anything with these right now? Or they're just past live streams? All right. Probably should get somebody just to do a basic edit on them. Put them in a folder where they can be found later on. All right, welcome to Teaching Strategies, the lecture series and education course. We are glad to present this course from Fairhaven Baptist College to anyone that wants to listen and hopefully be helped by it. And even if you are interested in taking the course for education credit from Fairhaven Baptist College, contact us to be able to do that. The purpose of this course or these lecture series is to explore and discuss various strategies used to teach effectively at all levels of instruction. The focus is primarily academic, but it can definitely be applied to religious instruction. And the series will revolve around a model profile of a competent teacher. The text that we're using as our outline, just to help me know what to talk about, is this one, Models, Strategies, and Methods for Effective Teaching by Helmut Lang and David Evans. And that's available on Amazon, used and new. I think I've seen some for as little as $6 to $8 or $9. So I think it's useful in a sense that it puts a lot of the things that we want to talk about if we're thinking through strategies and stuff related to teaching in one place. Some of the things that it's very, very academic in a certain sense. It talks about this researcher and that researcher. But these people are researching questions and ideas that we want to think about. And so it gives us a platform, an outline to be able to think through these subjects. So far, during this series, we have discussed the teaching competency profile. And then we talked about communication skills in October. In November, we talked about the diverse students that we have in our classrooms. In December, we talked about motivation and attitude. In January, we talked about assessments. And in February, we had issues with our internet connection across the whole campus, and there was no way we could have streamed the lectures. So here we are, March 9th, with our lecture tonight will be on classroom management. In between each of those, we've made available on the course webpage some other videos by Professor Don Maas out in California, and some very helpful things that were put together many years ago. Those of you that have watched it are probably laughing at dress styles and hairstyles and all of that. But what he has to talk about is very helpful. And since the last time we had class, we released so that you could watch the video on anticipatory set and closure. And just to review that a little bit, the anticipatory set is any activity that focuses the student on the learning by bringing forward prior knowledge to the present. So it's any time that whatever you do to bring the student's attention to what is going to be taught while bringing forward the things that has been taught. It involves active participation, which has been addressed already, whether that's overt or covert, outward or inward. Everybody, though, is actively participating. And of course, it needs to be relevant to the student's background and to the current learning, or the background current learning. He addressed some interruptions, some situations that might delay or cause you to have to restart an anticipatory set, and that would be some interruptions. And then talked about closure, and that would be how you wrap up a lesson. And really, all the things that are in the anticipatory set are also involved in closure. And closure is defined as the opportunity for the mind of the student to summarize what has been learned. And in that way, when you've done that, you have active participation by all, either overt or covert. That way, you have a method or a way to get the students to summarize in their own mind what they've learned. And if you can see that, then you have a good idea of whether they learned what you actually taught. So tonight, we're going to discuss classroom management. There's a lot of talking, a lot of writing, and even research about classroom management. And what almost everyone agrees is that it is foundational. And we'll just mention a few things before we get into it. But classroom management or discipline is foundational. I've heard people say that a large percentage, 90% of education is discipline. And the more I think about it, I think, well, hopefully not. Hopefully you're not disciplining 90% of the time. Now, I don't think that the person who said that really meant it in that way, but sometimes I've heard of, maybe even been in classrooms, either experienced or observed teachers that are so consumed with discipline, they want to discipline, that they don't get nearly as much teaching done as they should. So while it's true that if there's no discipline or there's no management of your classroom, you won't teach very much. And if there is discipline, you will teach a large percentage more than without it. But hopefully you are not managing your classroom or disciplining your students a lot of the time. If so, if you spend a lot of your time doing discipline and management, you're doing something wrong. And so hopefully we can talk about some of these things during this time tonight. Good classroom management frees the teacher to teach, and it enables and frees the students to be able to learn. It is foundational. It's something that must be existent in a clear way in the classroom, but it's there so that teachers can teach and students can learn. And the need actually for a proactive, for thinking about this and establishing things and implementing these things in our classroom is as great as it has ever been. There used to be a time in classrooms when students just automatically deferred some respect to the teacher because they were the teacher. But more and more as time goes by, we see less and less of that. Respect has been replaced by questioning and doubt and hesitancy, and not much of just automatically respecting the person that is speaking because they're in the front. Attitudes toward child rearing has changed. What we believe about how children should be reared and trained has changed. And I think that probably most everybody listening to this are in Christian schools or in Christian environments, but I think I've noticed that even in Christian homes, attitudes toward it has changed. I think it changes more slowly. I think we have revivals or renewals of good child rearing. But the world's system, the world's ideas about how to rear children are always around us, and they're constantly bombarding us, whether we feel the bombardment or not. It's there, we see it. And so the way we think about rearing children changes. It's affected by the world, and whether you are trying to teach, what we say, church families, children in your classroom, or maybe children that are reached through your ministries, we must have a well-managed classroom, and we have to think about it. The student population has changed. What students' abilities has changed. The ability to sit still and listen for 25 minutes or 35 minutes or 45 minutes is hardly there anymore. It's not something that is taught to children. It's not something that they experience very often. They've spent a lot of time, if they've sat still while they were in front of the TV, they were in front of a TV, and none of us are a TV, even though I'm coming to you through the means of a TV. But even sometimes, especially if we're working with, again, I think families reach through our ministries, you might even have language barriers that are there that those having a language barrier contributes to having a more rambunctious classroom. Let's just put it that way, a less, not as easy to be managed classroom. And then many students come from homes that the world would say their homes and their experiences put them at risk. We spent a little bit of time, a couple lectures back, talking about what defines a child being at risk. I'm not going to go into it anymore, but anytime there's uncertainty in their home, maybe there's one parent or they're with their grandparents, and those factors at least contribute toward uncertainty and situations that make it more difficult for students to just automatically be well behaved and listen in a classroom. Now, I've used already interchangeably the term discipline and classroom management, and I just want to talk about the word discipline. In the old days, we used discipline in a positive sense and punishment as the corresponding negative. We would say that teacher has a well-disciplined classroom. We're using that in a positive sense. Things are orderly, things happen the way they should, everything is going smoothly, and when something happened improperly in there, the student received some punishment or a penalty. Nowadays, it's very common for people to think, when you say discipline, to think of the negative, to think of discipline as some type of penalty or punishment action or behavior. And the new positive sense of the word is classroom management. So I would say that teacher manages their classroom very well. And that's because when a student doesn't behave in the proper way, she administers effective discipline. So the word discipline can be used in a positive sense or a negative sense. Rightly so, we can understand it both ways, and we're human beings who have brains, so we just listen to the context, and hopefully we understand what is meant, whether the discipline is used in a positive or negative sense. So, somebody decided to look at the idea of classroom management and student behavior in a classroom from a student's perspective, and they polled or somehow interviewed students to see how they thought about their behavior, what they were doing in a classroom. And a lot of either they asked the students or they observed and asked questions and deduced from these questions. But one of the things that students are doing right from the start is trying to figure out the teacher. They're just trying to figure out what does he expect, what does he allow. Some might be figuring out what does he see, what does he not see, how many questions can I ask, or how quietly can I do something else and he doesn't see it. They're trying to figure out the teacher, especially toward the beginning of a year or their experience with it. Another thing that students are trying to do in a classroom is have fun. They want to have fun. And all students are not mature enough to know what fun is. So they always, my experience is that they always think fun, if you just leave it up to them, they think fun is something unrelated to learning. Now, we can make learning very enjoyable. We can push them and get them to do things, and they can actually enjoy learning, but that's not what they first think of. They want to have fun. They're children. Even if they're 16 and 17-year-old children, they're still children. And they haven't gotten much maturity to want to do anything that's not fun. So they're trying to have fun. They might be just trying to give the teacher what he wants. They've learned enough, they've figured out enough about the teacher, and so they figure if I give him what he wants and only what he wants, then I can do what I want as long as he's happy. So sometimes that's what students are trying to do in a classroom. Another thing that students are trying to do is the minimum, just the minimum to get by, whether that's with assignments or behavior or activity, involvement, just the minimum to get by. Sometimes what they're doing, their activity, what they're doing is something to reduce boredom. They're bored and they don't want to be bored, so they're going to do something else. And that might be drawing a picture in their notes. That might be passing a note to somebody else in the classroom. Who knows? There's a lot of different activities that students would do to kill the boredom, but that's one of the things that they're doing. And another final thing that they saw, and I think there's plenty of other things, but these would be the behaviors that are less desirable, is to stay out of trouble. Just do enough to stay out of trouble. So I think this is really a helpful list. If we think about that list and say, this is where basic human behavior students are coming from. These are the things that are where they're coming from. And I know that your students aren't that way. Your children, at least, they're saved and they come to school completely ready to learn and all of that. I'm not saying students that have been trained, your students that just love your history lectures or your literature stories and all that. I'm saying just a student left to himself, this is what he wants. Do we cater to that? No, but we have to counteract it. And there's different things. Well, for one, we can reduce boredom by as much as possible, making our lessons and classrooms engaging. There's a lot of different ways to do that. We've talked about some, but make them engaging. If the student is just going to give the teacher what he wants, ask for a lot. Ask for the things that if he does them is going to instill, is going to just turn his insides into something where he will do stuff that he'll do the stuff you want because he wants to, not just because you want to. And that's where we use motivating things and all that. Anyway, many students are just trying to figure out the teacher, to have fun, to give the teacher what he wants, to do the minimum, not to be bored, to stay out of trouble. When we think about classrooms, here are some of the ways that problems come up, common problems in our classrooms. The first thing we think about is disruptions, disturbances. A student causes a disturbance that could happen in a lot of different ways. They get up, they speak out.
This is power, these two don't.
It popped the surge protector?
It might be that surge protector itself, because that was giving me problems a month ago.
Okay.
Whereas one didn't work and the other did.
Right, but it blew the whole thing.
Right, but that popped.
Yeah.
Let me run and grab a new surge protector.
Yeah, we were talking about causing disturbances.
Right, the kid doesn't mean to do it.
Okay.
And I've got it pulled up here.
Okay, so mine just stopped.
Should be there.
We're going?
Looks like it.
Okay, then I'll just get going even though I can't see it. All right, sorry about that. All of a sudden the lights went dark. I don't know if you saw it go dark, but we blew something. Anyway, we were talking about causing disturbances. Maybe I shouldn't say that too often. But a disturbance can come even from somebody who sneezes, or they're coughing, or it can be something that a student maybe can't help. But we have to know how to respond to it, and the rest of the class needs to be taught how to respond to those types of things, so it doesn't become a disturbance that can be controlled, that should be controlled. Anyway, causing disturbances, again, speaking out without raising your hand or without being acknowledged by the teacher, getting up and walking around, any type of disruptive behavior. Another thing that can be a problem is having the right or proper relationship with students. There's a dynamic in the classroom. There's the teacher and there's the students. And average teachers are human beings, students are human beings, and we kind of want to have a good relationship with the student. We know that having a good relationship with them is going to be conducive to them learning what we're trying to teach them. And so there's a balance though that we're trying to figure out, that teachers are trying to figure out, of how they can gain respect and still be kind. Can they joke with a student? If they joke with them, does the student feel like, well, now they're on my level? All of that type of thing. Even poor attitudes among students or attitudes between teacher and particular students. These types of things are problems in a classroom. Then there's organizing type of problems. This would be something like when you're working with the whole class, you're trying to teach the whole class, or the whole class is doing something, and a particular student needs attention. So how can you help one student when the whole class needs, without losing the rest of the class? Organizing. Motivating. So you want to keep students' interest. You have a 45-minute class period, and you have their interest at the beginning, but are you going to keep their interest through the whole thing? What can you do to keep their interest? Or maybe there's a subject or there's a student that is really, really excited, and their excitement is so high that they're a little rambunctious. How do you control their excitement without killing it? So that's a problem. There's problem behaviors. If a student consistently or often doesn't do his homework, comes to class without his books, is absent from class. He's in school that day, but he just isn't there. Cheats. These are kind of bigger type problems. And then one that is really a common problem that we have to think about, I have to think about, is controlling yourself. Studying yourself, thinking about yourself, knowing what are your triggers. What is it that students do that drive you nuts? You have to know that. You have to learn that. If you can learn what it is that drive you nuts, then you talk to yourself about not, recognizing that and not knowing how to respond to it with a predetermined plan rather than it making you go crazy. So knowing your triggers, staying calm and unaffected. Many people will insist, and I think it's true, when we are uptight and jittery, it just makes more of the students to be uptight and jittery. If And when I say unaffected, of course we're affected, but if what a student does really, it just changes our behavior, that's going to change other students' behavior. And whether that's what the student wanted and now he's in control of the classroom instead of you, or it's not what he wanted and nobody's in control of the classroom, either way, we have to remain, our demeanor needs to be unaffected by what the students do. Our demeanor. I'm not saying that we don't respond to what they do, but we can't let it change us. So, those are common problems that occur in classrooms, and then, and here are some aspects. I'm going to go through this list of aspects quickly, and because we're going to go through them again and kind of divide them into 3 categories for the rest of our time. So, aspects of classroom management: getting off to a good start, organizing the classroom and classroom supplies, choosing, establishing, and maintaining rules and procedures, managing students' work, using rewards and penalties, maintaining good student behavior, organizing and conducting instruction, managing special groups, evaluating classroom organization and management, and communication skills. All of those things, and there's probably others, but all of those are aspects of classroom management. And as we go through the rest of the time, we're going to look at those, put those into 3 different categories. We're going to put them into a category of preventive approaches, things that we can do in our classroom or establish in our classroom that prevent misbehavior. We can, then there'll be supportive approaches, and these are things that we can do in our classroom or establish in our classroom that support or push students toward good behavior, desirable behavior. And then there is corrective approaches, things that we need to do. How do we address misbehavior, or things that when things happen that we don't want to happen. So, preventive approaches. These are, as we think about managing our classroom or having a well-disciplined classroom, there's some things that we want to do from the start. There's some things we want to establish in the room that just makes it harder to misbehave because of the things that we've done. So getting a good start is something that people talk about a lot. You want to start off the year right. You want to start the day off right. You want to start the unit off right. All of it, but really it goes all the way back to starting the year off right. Start whatever classroom management plan you have, and that reminds me, I've mentioned since the very first lecture, smartclassroommanagement.com, and we'll talk about him and his website and his strategies and stuff at the end again, but I would highly recommend that you go to his website, subscribe to his weekly newsletter, and almost every time he writes something, it's going to be helpful and beneficial to you. You are going to have to figure out how to take it and how does it fit in the school where you teach, but the principles that are there are tremendous, and almost all of them are right in line with what Christians would believe. So anyway, you want to start right, get a good start right away. Whatever it is that you've planned, which we're going to talk about establishing rules and procedures, but all your rules and procedures, everything that you have, all your classroom management plan that you've decided this is the way the classroom is going to work, you start it right from the start. You don't give them a week to get used to being in school and then start it. You start right from the beginning. Every student deserves to learn in your classroom. Now, the way this is stated, and I've seen it in several different ways, and at first I feel a little like the students are entitled, but it's not spoken that way, and in a sense, they are entitled. They've come to your classroom, they deserve to be able to learn. Every student in your classroom deserves to learn in your classroom, and you must decide that you will do everything you can to protect their right to learn, even if it means penalties for students who do something that disrupts that right, that entitlement. Bill here, he deserves to learn. And if Susie is making it so he can't, she needs punishment. She needs a penalty. She needs addressed. She needs stopped for Bill's sake and for her sake, because she's not learning when she's not paying attention herself. But that's one thing, that's one way, and this is kind of a thought that I think even myself, I need to remember it and remind myself of. But having a well-managed classroom is for everybody in the classroom. Most of the time, when we're thinking about it, we're thinking about those kids that are disrupting and just keeping them calm so that we can get across what we want. But really, some major focus of it is the kids that aren't learning because Billy is disrupting. So that's part of getting a good start, is having that attitude toward things, starting right away, follow through, right away. Follow through. Set up what you are going to do, and follow through with what you say you're going to do. This is hard to do. In human nature, it's hard to do, but it's something we must learn to do, and we must continually improve at. Follow through. Some people say that students should have a part in establishing the rules of the classroom. They talk about a classroom constitution, maybe, or talk about this. Students should write rules. It reminds me of the children's story that we talk about, that we tell about, is it Big Jim? And the school teacher came and said, we're going to have all these rules, and this is the punishment for the rules, and the kids wrote the rules. In reality, to me at least, this is fake and everybody knows it. If the students could really make up the rules, they could get together and say, we want this rule, and if it's a rule you didn't agree with, you'd put it on the board. And that's not going to happen, I don't think. Maybe there's a place where it would, but so I think the idea of establishing rules and the students having a part and having a say in it is really fake and not worthwhile. Don't waste the time to do that, in my opinion. And then another thing here, getting a good start, and this is a mental state of mind, but if you think about it, and you might have to consider it for a while, one of the best ways to care about your students is to not care about what they've done so much as to hold grudges and keep in your memory their previous behavior. Okay, so we have this plan. This is how my classroom is going to work. When a student violates something in the classroom, he gets a particular consequence, punishment, whatever you want to call it. Bill does that. If I care about him, I'm going to make sure he gets the consequence. But I'm also going to care enough about him that I don't hold that against him. I don't say, why is it that Bill did that in my classroom? Bill is a human being, and he made a mistake, and he got the consequence, and it's taken care of. So we can't hold grudges towards students for doing something, and we really can't. We just let the management plan take care of it. We can't say, Bill, that's the 14th time in 2 days. Maybe you would say that. But you can't be holding this. The system has memory. You have to only think about what's going on there. And let the system, design a system that has consequences for repeated behavior, but let the system be Mr. Mean Guy, and you be the one that's protecting his right and everyone else's students in the classroom's right to learn. So you might need to think about that some more, but you care more when you don't let your feelings get involved and don't feel like the student has violated you by misbehaving in your classroom. Okay? So that's part of getting started right. Start off on the right foot, get started right. The second thing that we'll talk about as a preventive approach is to establish rules and procedures. So I think all of us understand this. Everybody has seen it, learned it, heard it from somewhere. But we'll just review some things, and maybe some of the things I say will remind you of something that's helpful. So be sure that your rules and procedures are helpful. I have been in classrooms here at Fairhaven Baptist Academy, Christian Academy, wherever, where a teacher had a rule or had a procedure maybe, and it wasn't helpful. It took even more time than if they had did it a simpler way, but it had to be done that way for I don't know why. I'm sure that they had a reason for it, but they didn't think it through well enough because it wasn't a helpful rule. The procedure wasn't really helpful. I know at one time when you responded to a teacher, you'd have to stand up, step to the side of your desk, push your chair into the desk, and then address the teacher. That's a procedure that's very belabored and long. It's not conducive to teaching. Now, it's conducive to an orderly classroom, and maybe there's time for that and time for less. But either way, think through the rules you have in your classroom. And really, most of what we're talking about, classroom rules, are up to the teacher. Even if you're in a school with a lot of rules, there's a lot of things that happen inside the classroom that is up to you. It's up to your interpretation, it's up to your expectation, it's up to the procedures that you've decided. I'm not saying that you go against your school's rules, but school's rules are kind of big. They're very surface level. When you're getting inside your classroom, how is this going to work? You have a lot of control over that. So, be sure the rules and procedures are helpful. Second, teach the rules and procedures. Now, this is something that I have to make myself do. You can't just read them. You can't just read the rules, state the rules, and go on to the next one. You have to teach them. What does the rule mean? What does the rule look like? You might have a why for the rule. You might not have a why, but you can't just read the rule and say everybody knows what that is and go to the next one. Teach the rules, and then model the rules. Model the rules and procedures. Show the students exactly what you want. You can even show what happens when students don't follow the rules and procedures. I heard about a teacher who had a rule that their book bags could not be in the aisle. They couldn't bring them to their desk, or I don't know what the rule was, but having a book bag in the aisle was against the rule, wasn't part of how the classroom should act. And he went so far as to walk up to the classroom. He tripped on the book bag, fell down on the floor. He was in obvious, grotesque pain. He ended up with a cast on his leg, and he was coming up trying to teach the class in crutches. All of this was just an act to illustrate why we don't put bags in the aisle. Now that's very extreme. It's very animated or whatever. But but you better believe that every student, the next time they wanted to put their bag in the aisle, they remembered their teacher on crutches in front of the classroom. They might thought he was dorky to do that, but they knew that they shouldn't put the bag in the aisle. They didn't forget it. So you don't have to put it doesn't have to be show and tell for the first 3 months of school, all the different rules and variations of how the rules get broken, but model the rules, model the procedure. This is what I want. We're going to do this, and then we do this. And when you model it, exaggerate the little details, because students see that. Exaggerate the details, and then have a couple students do it for you, for the rest of the class. They get to act out. What are we going to do? Are there any questions? The whole class should see you do it, should see one of their peers doing the procedure. And then you pick out any little thing that they didn't do right and let them do it again, or let someone else pick out what they didn't do right, and then that person gets to do the whole procedure. In this way, What you expect is well ingrained, very much so ingrained into their mind, and they don't have many questions about what you expect. And that's what you want. You don't want any question about what you expect, because when they don't do what you expect, you immediately give them the consequence for not doing it. Even high schoolers should have much time spent on your expectations. I think I've fallen to this. I get to be thinking, I've been doing this for 25 years. These kids have been here for 5, 6, 7 years. They grew up here. I taught their parents, so their parents have told them how to act in the class, and I just expect that everybody knows how to act in the class. And when I expect that everybody knows how I want them to act, and I've never told them, explained it, modeled it, it never happens the way I want it to. So even high school students who've been in the school for a long time need to have a good amount of time spent on what you expect. Now, when you have rules, the rules that you set up for your classroom, I'm not saying that you're going to change the student handbook in your school, but for your classroom, you should have as few rules as it takes to protect your classroom's learning environment. You could take 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 of the violations in the student handbook, all can be encompassed in one rule. And I should have taken the time to think it through, but not disrupting the class. No disruptions. Well, talking is, passing notes is, speaking out without raising your hand, all these different things that are rules that are infractions, that are named infractions, could be encompassed in that. Students, everyone will be on task, will pay attention to the teacher and be on task. That's one rule. If somebody's looking out the window, they're breaking the rule. There's so many things that are not that you only need that rule. You need more than that rule. But if you can limit, you can say, in this rule, in this classroom, these are our 4 rules, then that makes it simple for students. They know, as long as I'm doing these things, I'm doing what's right. And Michael Linson, on his Smart Classroom Management, wrote an article once about, I can't remember the name of it, but basically he said, as an exercise, write down all 2 things. Write down the rules that your classroom has. What are your classroom rules? And then write down all of the activities that you don't want to happen in your classroom. Okay? And then in a kind of either in a visual way or in a mental way. If you did it in a visual way, you'd say, my classroom, and then this is my classroom, and these are my rules. Etc. Okay? And then you would put out here behaviors. Misbehaviors. And you have listed all the misbehaviors that could happen in your classroom. And you look at every single one and say, okay, is this misbehavior addressed by one of my rules? If it's not, it will be in my classroom. But if you have thought of all the different misbehaviors you have in your classroom and you say, okay, this rule stops that one, and that one, and that one, and that one, and this one, all of these misbehaviors are addressed by this one rule. And then this rule takes care of that one, and that one, and that one, and that one. If you have 4 rules, and those 4 rules address every misbehavior you can think of, you have enough rules. You don't need 12 rules when 4 will do. And having only 4 makes it very easy to say, Bill, the rule is this, and you were not doing that. No arguments, just matter of fact. And I would say, and I'm going to say this later, but as the students get older, you don't need to do that right in front of the classroom, unless he's blatantly disrupting the classroom. But even in those cases, you just stop and look at him, put a mark on your piece of paper. He and everyone else in the classroom knows that he broke a rule. So this is what I mean by have as few rules as necessary. State them broadly, but simply, but broadly enough. It might be that you've got all this, and there's this one behavior here that gets through your rules, protective rules around your classroom. But if you change one word in this rule, now it addresses this behavior. So you didn't really even need another rule. You just needed to tweak the ones that you had. You might need to add a rule. But this is a good exercise to do when you're thinking about the rules that your classroom has and the procedures that you have, and trying to very simply say, in this class, these are the rules, these 4 things. Or maybe, and maybe it's 12 things, but 12 things is a lot less than 613 or whatever. Or 25. Make as few rules as you can that are easy to remember, and all of them, and they address then all the behavior that you want or don't want in your classroom. All right, so that is establishing rules and procedures, then preventing problems. And all this is still under preventive approaches. So there's get a good start, establish rules, and then some things for preventing problems. First, one of the things about preventing problems is just to have what I would call, and other people have, a matter-of-fact learning environment. Just, you come here, we just make some simple assumptions that everybody knows is true. Now, that's just the environment. We do have the rules, so everybody does know, but I have this matter-of-fact learning environment. It's designed for learning. You come here, this is designed for learning. And if you don't come here to learn, you don't fit in. So you want to change your behavior so that you do. Anything that takes away from this setting of learning is obviously not permitted. We're not going to let that here. This classroom is designed for learning. Okay? You might not say it that way, but I'm trying to get this matter of fact, we came here to learn. Anything that takes away from the opportunities to learn, we don't allow that here, because that's what this classroom is about. It's about learning. It's about learning Bible, or it's about learning economics, or it's about learning geometry, whatever the class is. That's what we do here. And if you're and any behavior that's keeping that from happening is obviously not allowed. So this is kind of a matter of fact, not vengeful, just matter of fact. That doesn't happen. Present your subject matter enthusiastically. This sometimes is hard to do. You don't feel well. You're ill. If you let the students' apathy toward the subject, if you let your brain think that those feelings are toward you, it can just be like, I don't even feel like seeing these kids or whatever. But present your subject matter enthusiastically. Find ways to get your students to succeed at learning often. Try to get them to have small successes, and if they can have small successes, they'll get them to have more successes. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. But work at finding ways for them to succeed. Not fake ways, but find ways for them to succeed, or to see that they've succeeded. And then that will motivate them to want to do it some more. Don't take misbehavior personally. We're all human beings. The students in your classroom are human beings. They're going to do wrong. Don't take it personally. And I would say, normally, don't confront students publicly. Now, if it's at younger ages and you have just simple discipline things, you can say, you didn't do that, that's a demerit, or however your school does things. But after a while, writing their name on the board or confronting them publicly isn't helpful. Most likely, they're not blatantly rebellious. They probably have rebellion in their heart, but it's not toward you. It's just because they want their own way, and the school wants more for them than that. Their parents want more for them than that. So picking on them publicly isn't helping. You don't win. You don't. Their peers like them more than they like you, and you just picked on one of their friends. So now you're a jerk to the rest of the classroom. If you can, in a calm way, catch them afterward and say, "Now I saw that you weren't on task, and you know when you're not on task, I put a mark, and that takes away from whatever. However your classroom management plan works, they know you saw them, and that punishment, whether it's that one or the next one or each time, pretty soon it's going to bite, and it will do, if your plan is a good plan, it will work to motivate them to change their behavior." So don't take misbehavior personally, and don't let your confrontation or don't let your addressing misbehavior become personal or even look like it's personal. It doesn't help. Stay calm. Stay calm. We talked about this already, but if you are excitable, if you get all agitated, your students will be also. Then I just want to mention some things. Most of you are experienced teachers, so you already know all these things. But I'm just going to list out some typical classroom procedures or things that happen in a classroom or with a class that you'll want to think through. What are your procedures? What are your routines for this? So I'm just going to read them quickly. If I say them too fast, just hit pause, rewind, and listen to it again. Behavior during morning opening events. Handling attendance and tardiness. Entering and leaving the room. Beginning and ending a period. Obtaining quiet in the room. Are you going to yell? Are you going to count down? Are you going to give a signal? Obtaining quiet in the room. Talk during presentations. Participating in questioning or class discussion. Getting or putting away equipment and references. Taking out or putting away books and supplies. Distribution of materials and supplies. Behavior during seat work. Getting help from the teacher or from other students. Notices or information about assignments. Consequences of late assignments. Handing in and returning assignments. What do you do when an assignment is done early? Participation in groups. Moving from one area of the classroom to another or from one area of the building to another. Changing classes. Sharpening pencils. Going to the restroom. Using the wastebasket. Homework. Working in the library. Visiting somewhere off of school campus, like a museum or the fire station or whatever, a field trip. Behavior when guests are in the classroom. Interruptions, there's a knock on the door. There's an announcement over the intercom. Behavior during emergencies. Safety routines in the gym or in labs and emergencies. And there might be other things, but that's a list there to get your mind thinking. You might think, oh, I've got all those, or I didn't think of something there. So there's some typical times where classroom procedures and routines are needed. All right, so those were some things to think about as we we have approaches for preventing misbehavior. Now, I want to look at some that support good behavior, approaches that support what we're trying to do in a classroom. And so, because if students are busy doing what they ought to do, they're not going to be as inclined or not even going to think about doing something they shouldn't do. So if we can have the supportive approaches that are working very well, that's going to just cut down on opportunities to misbehave. So the first supportive approach to mention is classroom climate. the classroom climate. What atmosphere, what environment are you producing in your classroom? And some things to remember here is to keep a positive perspective. Keep a positive perspective about what's going on, how enjoyable it is to learn what you're doing, how well the students are doing with what you're teaching them. Keep a positive perspective. Secondly, avoid over-dwelling on student misbehavior or apathy. It is easier to see when students do something wrong. It is easier to see the students that don't care. And I think we ought to address that. We ought to try to do something about that, but don't over-dwell on it. If that's all you see, and that's all you think about, pretty soon that's all you're going to talk to that student about. That's all the class is going to know that you're seeing is the students that don't care. If we over-dwell on misbehavior and apathy, that just puts a dark cloud into your classroom, even for the students that are behaving just fine. Organize the physical environment. So your classroom climate does even have to do with the physical environment, the tables, the chairs, the desks, the bulletin board, the closet, wherever. Some questions. And the idea here is, are you asking for trouble by where you're putting children or sending children? So can all the students see you? If when you're in the normal place that you teach from, or in all the places that you teach from, if a student is in a spot where they can't see, whether they want to learn or not, if they want to hear what you're saying, they're going to have to do some type of behavior to get to where they can see. That might be bad behavior, it might not be, but you're just asking for trouble if all the students can't see you. Then, can you see all the students when you are teaching? Is there any student in a position where you can't see them? That's asking for trouble. That's just a matter of rearranging, takes care of this, just changing the physical environment. What about traffic patterns? Now this happens more in, I would guess, in elementary classrooms, but even in high school classrooms, students are going in and out of a classroom. They have to do certain things at certain times. I've tried to think of this in my band class. They're all supposed to go into the room to put their instruments away, and they've got to put their music in certain places. So rather than have them all 47 trying to cram into one corner, try to spread out the places where they put their music so there's not as much traffic. Anyway, think about traffic patterns. When you are telling the students to do something, and we're in the middle of the year, maybe just sit back rather than start doing something else. Just stand there and watch your students do it. Go through something, and you might see that you've designed your classroom in a way where they're just going right, hitting each other. And you could just change the procedure, add a little instruction to it, change the furniture, change where they're going or something so that it flows better. You know as well as I do, if students are passing each other, they're bumping each other, they're either bumping each other inadvertently or they're punching each other because the other guy is their best friend and they think it's funny or whatever. There's a lot of different things that can happen, but if we can change the flow of things, we can cut down on misbehavior. And be a lot more productive in our classroom. Are the materials and supplies readily accessible? Okay, or you got all your stuff. Is everything that they need, everything you need, everything that the students need accessible and ready for whatever it is that you're doing that day? And then classroom climate, and we mentioned this earlier, but let's just spend another minute or so talking about it. Try to organize student learning and success. You want to organize the learning, but also organize successes. Now, I'm not saying tell a kid he's a success who isn't. But at the same time, a student who isn't a success isn't going to be very motivated to learn. So give him something to do that he can succeed at. We know success breeds success, right? I mean, I know it's kind of just a saying, but it's a saying that almost goes without needing explanation. People that succeed, they thrive on it. They want to do it again. They want to succeed some more. Failure, doesn't motivate. A kid fails, you go to do something, I go to change the light bulb on the car or try to do something, and it didn't work the last time, I find everything else in the world to do before I'm even going to try to do that the next time, because I don't like failing, and I'm not good at cars. But, so failure doesn't motivate. So if a kid fails all the time, that's not motivating them. A very, very weird kid who fails a couple times and just like says, buckles down and says, I'm not failing again. There are some, but those kids have a support system. Their parents are driving them through that. They know that if they fail again, it's just going to be worse and worse. And again, I'm not saying be artificial, but figure out a way to help your kids succeed. Figure out a way to help them overcome failure. These truths help your classroom and they help your students. When kids are succeeding, and they're not fake successes, they are accomplishing and they're succeeding, they go to your classroom and they're getting what they want, and what they want is success, not being lazy and doing whatever. They're succeeding, they're learning something, they're accomplishing. They're going to want to be in your classroom. They're going to want to find out what's the next thing that they can learn to do. So work toward that, or at least think about it and consider it, especially with students that maybe are struggling. All right, so that's classroom climate. Another supportive approach is managing and monitoring student work and behavior. So you've given students work and behavior, and now you have to, you're just monitoring it or managing it. They're kind of on their own. Consistency is very important here. Consistency is important in all discipline and management situations, but it's very important here. And I would say it's especially important for your better students. A student is a good student, and they just did something that the classroom plan says isn't allowed. Do you overlook it because he never did it before? He didn't really mean to do it? Or does he get the same consequences as everyone else? So what happens when you overlook it because he never did it before and he didn't really mean to do it? He got away with it. And because he's a good student. Other students see that and they get resentful. He becomes a teacher favorite, even if he's not a teacher favorite, but he becomes a teacher favorite. What happens to him? He happens to slip up in another class. He didn't mean to. He honestly didn't mean to. But in another class, the teacher says, man, that was really odd. He doesn't normally do that. I'm not going to give him a consequence for it. I'm not going to address that. So pretty soon, the good kid is treated wrong, and he begins to think, I can get away with things. As long as I work hard most of the time, I can get away with things. And that's wrong. That's wrong for him, from us as teachers. And it's wrong for him to think that way because human nature is going to test that. It's going to push the boundaries. And someday he will get the consequence, and it'll be much bigger thing than a classroom rule or procedure. So even especially good students need to be held to the same standard as everyone else. All right, then let's talk about some basic management skills. Some skills that we have to use and employ in order to have a good classroom. And these are things that support good behavior. There's 4 of them. First is teacher awareness. Somebody called this with itness. The teacher's with it. But teacher awareness, and this is seeing what's going on in your classroom. It happens but it doesn't happen by growing eyes out the back of your head. But we all remember the story, or you've had a student tell you about another teacher who saw what happened in the back of the classroom when they were at the chalkboard. Well, how does that happen? They're with it. They know what's going on. But it also happens because they're purposeful in the way that they address situations in the classroom. A student over here has a question. I could talk to that student this way, right? And I can't see that you're laughing at me. Or I can talk to that student this way and I can see the rest of the classroom. If I'm writing on the board, when I wrote on the board before, I turned my back to you completely. But I could write a little this way so that I can see more of the classroom while I'm writing on the board. So that being aware isn't a special, sixth sense as much as it is thinking through where you place yourself in times when you're not specifically watching and seeing the whole classroom. How can you see at least some of what's going on? If I can see this much of the classroom, if somebody over here is interacting improperly with somebody over here, and I see something, if I see a student right there and he's looking that way, I know something else is going on, and then I've seen it. Even though I didn't see him, I saw the activity. I might miss something that's behind me, but position yourself. That's one of the biggest parts of being aware, is positioning yourself so that you don't lose the view of the whole classroom at any time. So, teacher awareness. The next one is movement management. Movement management, and this is the idea of having your transitions in your classroom be smooth, using the momentum that you have in your classroom. You're teaching along. Don't abruptly stop if you can. So the movement is more of the idea of ideas, the flow of ideas, not actual physical movement. Then group focus. Group focus, keeping, and this is the idea of being able to keep the whole group focused on what you're teaching. And this is accomplished especially by using good questioning. Good questioning helps this tremendously. Some things we've mentioned questioning a couple of times before, but a really big thing that helps with keeping the group's focus is to wait after asking the question before calling on a student. Research says wait 5 seconds, but wait for 5 seconds. Everybody's, during those 5 seconds, they're paying attention because they don't know if you're going to call on them. So they're paying attention. Now, I say everybody. Maybe there's that one that wasn't paying attention at all, but you're obviously going to notice him. But you're helping the rest of the students stay focused on what you're doing by waiting. Don't call a person's name off before you even ask the question, and don't call a person's name off immediately after finishing the question. And for sure, don't answer the question yourself. So, avoid repeating questions. If you ask the question and then ask the question again and then rephrase it one more time, you're teaching students not to pay attention. Just ask the question. And if they weren't paying attention, they're going to be like, oh no, I wasn't paying attention. And they'll pay attention better the next time. Avoid asking, does everyone understand? This is something that I still do. Anybody have any questions? No? Great. Okay. When you ask that question, that's a signal. That's a signal that we're done. So students, if I ask, does anybody have any questions? The one student that does have a question just became the scumball that made class last longer and didn't let us go do what we wanted to do. All right, and that's maybe an exaggeration, but in a certain sense, as soon as I signal we're done by asking that question, people, their minds are shut down. That's not a way to keep their focus on things. Figure out a different way to find out whether you are getting their understanding in what's going on. And then overlapping. A skill is that they call overlapping is when you're able to do something that addresses misbehavior or inattentiveness without stopping your teaching. You're teaching along, and if you've taught for any length of time, you've seen this. You're teaching along, and I think it's Bill is in that seat there. Bill is doing something. He's not really disrupting the rest of the class, but he's doing something where he's just kind of a little bit distracted. He's doing something with his piece of paper or whatever, if I can go over and just stand next to Bill's desk and maybe even just put my hand on his desk, all of a sudden Bill's attention is on me again. And that is overlapping. That's drawing his attention back to what I'm doing without myself disrupting the rest of the class. As soon as I say, Bill, what are you doing with that paper? I stopped teaching. Everyone else stopped listening to what I was saying. Everyone else started looking at, what's Bill doing with that paper? But managing a classroom, I don't want to have to stop and stop my teaching every time I see some behavior, minor little behavior. So whether it's moving to a different spot in the classroom and that movement catches the attention of someone, whether it's walking up to a student, it might be just putting your hand on their shoulder. Maybe they're doing seat work. And you can tell that, somebody's not paying attention. You could just walk up, put your hand on their shoulder. You don't have to disrupt everyone else's seat work by speaking. Just put your hand on their shoulder, or you just put something on, point to their desk, and they're right back on task. And you have helped everyone do what they're supposed to do without disrupting everyone that's already doing what they should do. So that's a skill called overlapping, handling more things, more than one thing at a time. And basically, it's being able to do something that addresses misbehavior or inattentiveness without stopping your teaching. Preventive, we're still talking about preventive approaches. What do we do with minor disruptions? There are things that, and kind of, I talked about this with the overlapping skill. Some disruptions are minor. They're disrupting you because you're in the front of the classroom, but they're not really disrupting very many other people in the classroom. Maybe they're not disrupting anyone else in the classroom. Knowing how to address that without escalating it to a major disruption is something that you should learn to do. Don't let minor distractions take away from the learning of everyone else. But don't let that minor disruption grow into being a major one. So figure out, is this something that's affecting everyone else? And this is, of course, while you're teaching. Can I address that? Can I make that go away without stopping everyone else's momentum in learning? Another thing that prevents misbehavior is increasing the academic learning time. I don't have any notes about this, but it just occurs to me that sometimes we spend so much time on a procedure. Procedures are supposed to be quick and get a routine done and out of the way so that we can spend our time teaching. And if you don't have an efficient procedure, then you spend a lot of time collecting papers. And then maybe you're looking through the papers. Bill, where's your paper? And you spend all this time just on administrative things or on procedural things or announcements and all this kind of stuff. That's boring. It really isn't learning anything. So if we can cut down all the peripheral things and increase the actual learning time, what we came here for, as a matter of fact, we came here to learn, right? This is what we do in our classroom is we learn, so we cut out all that. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but we make it short. We develop routines, ways to do things that cuts out that and gives us all this wonderful time to actually learn something that prevents misbehavior because we get right into what we're doing, what we're there for. So increasing academic learning time. And then the last one that we'll talk about for preventing misbehavior is giving directions. Giving directions. You should have a routine yourself or something that contains most of these things or all of them when you're giving directions. And the first is to secure attention. Don't try to give it directions or instructions without having everyone's attention. So, secure attention. If you're in the middle of a class period and you're going to be giving an instruction, and let's say that's older students where you've given them assignment and they might be working away on it, you might just announce, say, in 5 minutes, I'm going to be giving us some instructions about what to do about this. That's little enough of a disruption to their work that they can just keep working on it, and they know that pretty soon the teacher's going to get up and they're going to have to stop what they're doing. That's kind of kind if a student is really working on something. With younger students, they're not that mentally engrossed in what you're learning in the classroom, and you're going to get their attention. Either way, you've gotten their attention. You might have alerted them ahead of time that you're going to get their attention. You have a signal, some way to get their attention. Are you going to yell? Are you going to have a hand sign or a certain word that you say that means everybody's attention? Anyway, secure their attention. And then I think it's best, and I'm trying to do this myself, I'm trying to learn it myself because it is best, is to use, set up the instruction, especially if it's something that they're going to do right away. And by set up, I mean you're going to use a phrase like in a moment or on my signal or some other phrase like that that tells them not to do it yet. Keep listening. That in a moment says keep listening until he finishes talking. If you have even teenagers, you start saying something and then they go off to do it and they heard the first thing and they didn't hear the next 5 things. They're teenagers and could have remembered 12 things, but they went off and did the first thing. Either way, in a moment, on my signal, that helps everyone hear what they're supposed to do. So set up the directions and then be clear and concise. If you find that students are often not getting your instructions clearly, practice on someone else. If you're new, practice on somebody. You have a fellow teacher, say, I've been having a hard time, kids don't seem to be understanding what I want them to do, and so I've been thinking through. If I say this, what do you think I mean to do? I mean for you to do. And get their impression. You might not be being clear. If they have experience, they might say, oh, I know exactly what you want, but I found that it's better if you say it this way. So be clear and concise. You don't want long, rambling directions. So give those clear and concise directions. Check up before releasing them. You might say, give the instructions, okay, and then say, all right, so Bill, what is it that the class is going to do once I release you? And hear what Bill has to say. If Bill says what you are expecting, then you can kind of assume the rest of the class is going to do it. If he says something else, you say, oh, now that's close, but let's just adjust that. I must not have been as clear. Check up with someone, have someone tell you what the class is going to do, and then, of course, if it's something that they're doing in your classroom, you release them to do it, they get to work, and then you monitor for difficulties or even for successes. And also anticipate questions. If you're going to give these instructions, what questions are they going to have? They might have questions about the concept that you're having them do. They might have questions about the procedures. I'm done. What do I do? Well, you anticipate that. When you're done, you can work on this. When you're done, put your paper here, or whatever. Anticipate those types of questions. All right. So those are the procedures, the approaches that we can use that help prevent problems. Now, corrective approaches. Corrective approaches. The first corrective approach is our consequences. A punishment, a penalty, a consequence, all different kinds of words we can use for this. But when we give consequences, somebody has violated the rules of the classroom, somebody has broken the rules of the classroom, they need to have a consequence. When we give out these consequences, when we give the demerits out, when we give the penalties out, whatever they are, the punishment out, we must be consistent. We've said this a few times, but it must be consistent. Secondly, you can have consequences for doing good. But do not reward students for merely keeping the rules. Many times we do this, and I've probably done it myself, even if it's a verbal praise. Praise somebody because they just kept the rules. Well, you're such a great student, you kept the rules. Great students don't keep the rules. I mean, they do way more than keep the rules, right? So don't praise or reward students just because they did what was expected. But it's nothing wrong with saying, oh, that was good, I knew you could do it, but don't reward them for doing what they should have done. And actually, verbal personal praise can be very rewarding. So again, if maybe somebody has had a hard time paying attention and they do it, and what happens when they actually pay attention and stay on task? They really accomplish something. So there's nothing wrong with saying, look, I knew you could do that. What did they do? Well, they accomplished something. You're not rewarding them, praising them for just paying attention, but you're rewarding them with a verbal praise for accomplishing something, and you know that the reason they did it was because they did what they were supposed to. There's a question about how to handle disruptive behavior in what's now called an inclusive classroom. So if your classroom has, let's just use these words, regular students and special students in the same classroom. So I haven't had this personally. I guess I have had it personally in a band class that's already a little different. But I have found, and my experience from people that are in more academic type classrooms, we have found that quote-unquote regular students adapt very quickly to having special students in their classroom. And they can handle the different expectations. So you're not going to let a special student just do whatever they want. You have to learn what it is they can and can't do. But there are some things that they're going to do that you're not going to let anyone in the rest of the classroom do, but the rest of the classroom knows that that behavior is not something that they can prevent, that student can prevent because of their situation, and they understand. They don't start trying to act like the special student. They know and can handle that quote-unquote or perceived inconsistency. That's been my experience with that. You should still have behavior expectations and consequences for students that are special students. They should know what's expected of them, and it should be clear to them. It's not like they can do whatever they want, but their consequences and their expectations might be different from the rest of the students in the class, and I've never had students not be able to figure that out really easily. Okay, then the last thing on corrective approaches is dealing with misbehavior and rule violations. And I would say these should be spelled out in your classroom management plan. There's a lot of different ways to do it. You want to be consistent. You want to think it through. I suggest looking at Michael Linson's Smart Classroom Management. He has a plan you can buy for $8 or something like that. Read through it. See how he does it. I think, well, I'm going to talk about him in a minute. So, but whatever you do, whatever misbehavior happens and rules are violated, you deal with it according to your plan that's been laid out ahead. And your classroom plan is going to use the structure of your school, but it's going to have specifics to your classroom. Administer your consequences consistently and dispassionately. And so that word comes up again. Don't get angry. Don't get flustered. Just administer it consistently and without passion. They did it. This is what happens. When you get all flustered, you lose. And the student loses too, whether they're all excited because they got you to flip out, or if they're hurt by it. Either way, it doesn't help the classroom. It doesn't help the rest of the students in the classroom. It doesn't help the student that caused it, and it doesn't help you. So keep your passions out of it. All right. Finally, I'm going to read through a list of common guidelines, and this would be kind of a review of what we've talked about. A list of common guidelines to think about and keep in mind when we're managing our classroom. First, remember school is a place to learn. Second, No one has the right to interfere with another student's opportunities to learn. And I'm saying second just because I'm going through the list, not like one is more important. So, but with those two things in mind, rules and procedures must be set in order for people to learn and no one to violate or take away other people's opportunities. There has to be rules and procedures. And rules must be promptly enforced. The fourth one, rules must be promptly enforced. When a student breaks a rule, he's chosen his consequence. Is a way to think about it. He broke the rule. He knew what the consequences were. He chose that consequence by breaking the rule. Separate the deed from the student. There we go. It comes up again. Don't, separate the deed from the student. The student does something stupid. The deed was stupid. You can't think the kid is stupid. And maybe there's, you can't let yourself think about that student over and over again. What he did, address what he did, and let it take care of itself. Separate the deed from the student. Keep a dispassionate spirit. Don't take misbehavior personally. They're not acting that way because they don't like you. They're acting that way because they're sinners. They don't know what's good for them. So don't take the misbehavior personally. Know when and how to keep parents involved. And I would say this is something that we could spend a whole lot of time just talking about and discussing. But sometimes, the age of the student is going to be, I'm not saying parents are never involved, but it's when and how to keep parents involved is something to learn and think through. Younger children probably sooner, and more often. As they get older, maybe not so much. Kids many times take personal responsibility for their actions, and if they can do that and it takes care of the situation, no need to call the parents up and tell them about it. But so know when and how to keep parents involved. Avoid public censure. So avoid publicly censuring a student. Don't argue, especially in front of the class. You never win an argument when you're in front of the class. So don't argue with students. Never ridicule students. You're not going to gain their respect by ridiculing them. Show no favoritism. We've mentioned this already. Show no favoritism. Here's one that we didn't really mention, but it needs to be said. Only punish the perpetrator. Don't punish the class. Say, all right, that happened, so nobody does something. Don't punish the class because somebody did something wrong. Only punish the perpetrator. And then finally, have a great lesson with great content. It is not the answer. Students will still do things wrong if you have a great lesson with great content, but fewer students will, and they'll do less if you have a great lesson with great content. All right, finally, some models of management and discipline, and I'm going to just read this. There are different models of discipline or different models of classroom management. People have probably heard of B.F. Skinner. There's Skinner's model, which is, I can't remember the name, but then there's Cantor has a model, Dreikers has a model, Kerwin and Mendeler has a model, Albert has a model, and there's just all different psychology. This is really get into psychology here. But as I say, even in an introduction to psychology, psychology at its surface level is just studying how people behave, how do people act, and that's why we're talking here today, because we're going to react, we're going to respond, we're going to set up a classroom so that students act and behave in a certain way, and we're going to respond to that. So we're talking about psychology the whole last hour and a half. Okay, so don't be afraid of the word, but these guys, many of them, are not biblical in their thinking. They have no biblical foundation for what they're doing. But let me just say, if you're in a school classroom, at least every school that I know of, you're not using a biblical model of discipline either. Because parents should spank their children. They do something wrong, you spank them. You're not spanking them every time they do something wrong. You have a different model. And hopefully, even parents don't have to spank their children every time they do something wrong because they stop doing things wrong. But either way, please understand, we don't use a strictly biblical model in schools So we have to use parts of many of these other models in our classrooms. But we should have a biblical foundation for what we're doing. And for sure, we shouldn't use unbiblical methods that are in these other things. And so I'm just going to say one more time about smart classroom management. I think Doug Linson or whatever. I think of his website and the things he says as a management model. He's probably not as famous as Skinner or Cantor or these guys, but I think of what he says and what he helps people understand as a management and discipline model. And I found it to be mostly consistent with biblical principles, even if he's using different terminology. He might be using current terminology that we immediately think of as being psychobabble. But if you think about, if you look at what he's saying and how we should react and think about students and what we should expect from students and all of this, I really think that most of what he says, I'm not saying every single thing, but I think almost everything he says fits, is consistent with biblical principles. And so that's why I have not kept myself from, that's why I have suggested that you subscribe to his website, and I even just said a few minutes ago, buy some of his books and stuff. I've bought some of them, and you have to, in all things, you have to keep your Bible-filtered eyes open while you're listening to me. We always have to do that. But I think as you keep your Bible-filtered eyes open, reading him, you're going to find that a lot of what he says fits in with what we believe, and it's helpful to hear it from another voice. And what he has to say about classroom management is very, very helpful and would fit in with basically everything that we've said in tonight's lecture. So I hope this has been helpful to you. There might be somebody that is, you're thinking of somebody in particular, a student in your class that you've had consistent issues with, and something that we've said tonight maybe prompts you to try to think of something else, a different way to deal with it that might be helpful. I hope that it is that way. So in 3 weeks, we will meet again, March 30th, and have another lecture. In the meantime, we will release the 6th video of Maintaining Teacher Effectiveness video. And actually, he talks about reinforcement there, which is somewhat related to what we've talked about tonight. So it will be kind of nice the way it lines up. But in the next 3 weeks, hopefully you can catch that workshop lecture from him. And then on March 30th, we'll have our next lecture here and discuss lesson planning and delivery. Thank you for watching. All one of you.